Welcome to History 111, Lecture 5, Religion and the Settlement of New England. Now, the religious conflicts that began with Henry VIII splitting with the Catholic Church are going to continue into this time period. But it's really important to understand that Henry VIII split with the Catholic Church is over who's in charge, not over theology. So in many ways, the new Anglican Church was very similar to the Catholic Church that had existed within England before. Now, other Protestant denominations were not being tolerated within England, and one group in particular, named Puritans, who wanted to purify the Anglican Church and bring about many religious reforms, were simply not tolerated and had to flee, and in particular they fled to Holland. Now, the Dutch had a really permissive attitude towards a lot of things because a lot of Dutch were Calvinists, and they believed that there were a chosen few who were going to heaven, and you would know who they were because they would live good lives and God would reward them. And as for the rest of the people, as long as they didn't bother anyone, the Dutch really didn't care who they were or how they lived or what they did, as long as they kind of just sort of stayed out of everybody's way. Now, the Puritans, on the other hand, are being forced to live in Holland because the Dutch will accept them because the Dutch really don't much mind anybody. But the Puritans believe in really strict standards of community behavior and believe in enforcing very strict religious rules. So they really don't fit in because the Dutch are very permissive and let people kind of do what they want, whereas the Puritans insist on a very strict code of conduct. Now, while the Puritans were free to practice their religion, this is an arrangement that's really not going to work out over time. And a group of Puritans known as the Scrooby Group are going to obtain permission from the Virginia Company to settle in that colony. However, they made landfall in present-day Massachusetts and had to stay the winter. Now, this group decided to go ahead and stay in Massachusetts, but since they had no charter from the king, they had no legal basis to settle outside of the Virginia colony, so they decided to form an agreement setting out their civil government, and the document becomes known as the Mayflower Compact and becomes the basis for their colony, and it really draws heavily on English rights and customs, and it becomes a kind of important document in American self-government, so it's one you definitely want to know about and be familiar with. Now, when these people arrive in Massachusetts, they discover two things. One is that Massachusetts had been largely devastated by diseases spread by previous European explorers. In addition, they also found that they were really ill prepared and needed the assistance of Native Americans to survive the first few years. In the beginning, both sides were open to the idea of living side by side as allies, and they tended to work together because both populations were really on the brink, but together they were stronger. Now, in addition to these first settlers, more waves of Puritans are going to come. And that's because there's religious turmoil and conflicts happening within England. Now, the big conflict is the English Civil War that's being brought on by James and his son Charles, who believe in the divine right of kings and tend to resist the drive towards parliamentary government. And ultimately, that's going to be settled in the battlefield in the English Civil War. Now, during this, there's also a lot of religious strife going on, and with the end of the English Civil War, what's going to happen is large numbers of Puritans who are dissatisfied with both the religious and political life of England are going to pick up and move to Massachusetts, where they believe they're going to find society more in keeping with their values and beliefs. Puritan society tended to be very strict by modern standards. First and foremost, the church was the center of not only religious life but also government. Now, each community had their own church and appointed its minister, and they were all sort of independent of each other. But within these communities, religion and law were often the same thing, and people who do not conform tend to be punished very harshly. One thing you have to keep in mind is these are colonies where the population has to work together or risk starvation, especially in those early years. So people who are drunk, lazy, causing a lot of arguments and causing things not to get done, they're posing a very serious risk to the whole colony, and as a result, they're very harshly punished. It's worth noting that there's some literary sources about Puritan life, although they're all written later, but these literary sources are very influential on American culture, and some good examples that are Young Goodman and Brown, The Scarlet Letter in particular, The Crucible, and The Crucible concerns one of the most famous incidences involving Puritans, which is the Salem witch trials, and it becomes a whole thing about how the power of theocracy and the relation between church and state there, and it shows how a dispute in the 1790s over how the minister ran the church leads to a number of people being executed as witches. Now, out of the Massachusetts colony, New England emerges, and what happens is the strictness of Puritan life and the general intolerance of other views leads to people leaving Massachusetts and settling in neighboring lands. And even subtle differences of view can sometimes be enough to provoke intolerance. In particular, there's some really important things to know, one of which is that non-Puritans had no voting rights in Massachusetts, so that leads non-Puritans to think about moving elsewhere. And Connecticut and Rhode Island are also very important colonies that are going to be settled this time by groups leaving Massachusetts because of a lack of rights or over religious disagreements. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, Massachusetts is all about Puritans who have a very strict lifestyle and a church and state that are very closely linked, whereas the rest of New England is all about groups who are forced out by disagreements with the Puritans, but do realize some of these groups were just as strict as the Puritans they left behind. See you in the next lecture.